Good. Okay, so, we're sort of on the downhill slide here. I think I told you that last time we spoke, that I thought we were pretty much done with the hardest part of the semester. And that really ended with the market structures there on chapter 10. And so what we're gonna do today is just begin to look at market structure, not market structures, begin to look at markets that we've already talked about, but from slightly different perspectives, or sort of delving into specific details of markets or things like that. And so that's really what I think these last chapters are for us, is us just looking at more specific market information and not so much the market structures. And so this chapter is on resource markets. Resource markets are just that. They're the market for resources. And if you can remember way back, it was one of the first few chapters that we covered. We talked about this circular flow model, where we had resource markets and product markets, and then we had firms and households, and we talked about how the money and the resources and the goods sort of flowed between those four parties. Well, we didn't really then go on to talk much about resource markets. We talked about the markets for final goods and services. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of double back and talk a little bit about resource markets, because there are some interesting things to say about resource markets. And then in chapter 12, we're going to talk about specifically labor and the market for labor, even though that is the example that your author uses in this chapter as well. But we're going to dig more into labor markets, because labor is an interesting resource, right? It's not like oil or lumber or steel or, right? It's people. And so it's kind of peculiar the way that particular resource behaves. But the resource market is just looking at the market for the resources that go into producing final goods and services. And the interesting thing is that households and producers sort of switch roles in the resource market. We become the suppliers as households of resources, and firms become the demanders of those resources. And so it's just sort of training your brain to think about this from an opposite perspective. But then we're going to dig a little deeper and talk about, the price of resources and why they look the way that they look, and how they're determined, and in some other things that are very specific to resource markets. Okay. All right. So in this case, your author uses labor as the resource for most of the examples. And here's why, is because you and I, as members of households, the resource most of us have to sell is labor. You might have some land someplace, and you might sell some oil and some trees and some entrepreneurial ability and that kind of stuff. And I hope that you do. But we're just talking about regular old labor, right? Which I assume you all have to sell. And I think your authors made that same assumption. So we are the suppliers of that. So people supply their resources, whatever resources you have, but labor specifically, to the highest paying alternative, other things constant. Well, that basically says that you and I are motivated by money. If all other aspects of two jobs in this example are equal, we will supply our resource or our labor to the highest paying use, the highest paying alternative. And that for the most part holds true, because what you and I want to do then is we want to take that money and turn around and create utility or satisfaction for ourselves with that. And the more money we have, usually the most utility or satisfaction that you can get for your resource. So demand, so this is the demand side of resources. As long as the additional revenue being the money that's coming in the door, as long as the additional revenue from employing another worker exceeds the additional cost, the firm will hire that worker. Okay, so the first thing to notice or to recognize is that labor is an expensive resource. That human resource actually costs you a lot more than just simply the wage that you're giving that resource, right? You have to usually supply some training, maybe some benefits, pay into workers' comp, provide a safe working environment. So make sure, you know, everything's up to safety codes for that person. There's a lot of other things you need to do for your human resources that you don't need to do for other resources. So they're pretty expensive. So you have to think about whether that unit of a resource, in this case labor, is going to earn enough for you in terms of revenue to afford to basically cover their costs. The thing we know about people in particular, other resources aren't very picky, but people and labor in particular, is that we must be paid more if we feel like a job is undesirable. So if we feel like we're selling our labor to a job that is nasty, dirty, dangerous, undesirable in whatever way, bad location, like whatever it is, we must be paid more to compensate for that. Now, another resource, oil or lumber or steel, they actually don't care, right? We're the ones that care. So we're an interesting example to use as a resource in a resource market because there's extra things you got to think about. So what I'm showing you here, really the only reason that you're being shown this graph is just to see that a resource market looks almost identical to any other market, right? We typically have an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve. There's nothing special about a resource market compared to a goods and service market. But in this case, you can see what we've done, and your author's setting you up for some examples, is that we are looking at labor, carpentry labor specifically. So when we find our equilibrium on this graph, and the price associated with that resource is really the wage, that's going to be that W there because we're talking about labor specifically. And then the quantity is the quantity of labor hours per period we would get at that equilibrium. So it's like any other market, upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, equilibrium price and quantity, it's all the same, okay? And that's all this is showing you. We're using the market for carpenters because we're about to carry that example forward through some more complicated examples, or more complicated graphs and concepts. Okay, so firms in this case are demanders, right? We switched those roles. Firms are the demanders of resources, and households are the supplier of resources. So in the resource market, right, we've switched roles. We still have our same objectives in mind. Firms still are interested in maximizing profits. And suppliers, us households, right, are still interested in maximizing utility. So the demanders of those resources, or the firms, still have their same objective, maximize profits. And we, as households, still have our same objective, maximizing utility, but we're just going at it from a slightly different perspective. And that is from the perspective of suppliers for households. Like, we're usually the demanders of goods and services, right? So we maximize utility and consumption. We went through that in chapter 6 when we talked about utility. Well, we're still trying to maximize utility, but it looks at it from a different angle. We have to earn the money to buy the things that maximize your utility. And the more money we earn, right, the more we can buy to maximize that utility. So it takes it one step back in terms of that utility maximization. And for firms, they have to employ the resources that help them produce to earn the maximum profits, right? So we're just going one step removed from what we've been talking about chapter upon chapter upon chapter. Any difference between the the profit maximizing goals of a firm and the utility maximizing goals of a household are sorted out through voluntary market exchange. All this is saying is that if we go back to the previous graph, right? This is us. We're that upward sloping supply curve. This is us trying to maximize utility. And that demand curve, that downward sloping demand curve, has to do with profit maximization, demanding resources for profit maximization. We work it out and come to an equilibrium through voluntary market exchange. So that's all this is saying, is that firms don't get to earn the most profit they want all the time, and we don't get the most utility we want all the time. We have to kind of come to the middle. We have to come to an equilibrium where they pay us a wage that helps us maximize utility while we offer our resources at a wage that helps them get the most amount of profit, stay in business, whatever. So if we were free, right, if resources were free, they'd be able to maximize profits even more. The fact is we're not, right? There's costs involved in employing resources. Okay, market demand for resources. The demand for a resource, this is an important tidbit of information up here. The demand for a resource is a derived demand based on the goods and services it helps produce. What this is saying is that, you know, NAU doesn't employ me just to have another employee. NAU employs me because I produce something that they value and that they can then sell, right? So the demand for me is derived based on, is concluded based on the things that I can produce for firms, for businesses, et cetera. That's how they decide what I'm worth. Now, I have different uses, right? I haven't always taught. I used to work a 40-hour week in private industry, a couple of different ones. I have different uses, but the supply curve for my labor and the demand for my labor, me specifically, is based on what I can do in my different functions. And the same goes for all resources, right? The demand for me, for my labor, is derived based on what I can provide to producers, okay? So a firm doesn't value the resource itself, but the ability of the resource to produce. I think NAU right now is running reports on every single solitary employee on this campus, trying to figure out what we produce and what its value is to see if they want to keep us or not, right? It makes sense from a business perspective. What value do you add to my business? What are you really worth, right? Because all of our demand is based on what we can produce. And that goes for a truckload of lumber, that goes for, you know, a truckload of oil, all of the resources that get used to produce final goods and services, right, have different uses and have a derived demand based on those uses, okay? So the market demand for a resource is the sum of demands for a resource and all of its different uses. If I'm working a cash register at Target, that is a use for my labor that comes at a very different rate, right? Has a very different cost associated with it than employing me as an economics professor at NAU, right? Is that a use for my labor? It absolutely is. It's probably not where I'm going to decide to sell my labor at this point in my life, but it is an option, right? And so market demand for a resource is the sum of the demand for the resource in all of its different uses. So let's take a tree. Let's try a different example. I realize some of you are like, a tree is best if it's still standing, right? I got you. But once you cut it down and once it becomes a log, right? What are all of its different uses? The demand for it, the market demand for that log, is based on all of its different uses. The very lowest valued use, which was probably turning it into firewood, toothpicks, paper, whatever, right? Those are probably some of its lowest valued uses. Or you can use it to build a home, to build, you know, high-end furniture. Like the value, the demand, right, is for that log is going to span all of its different uses, okay? as the price of a resource falls, producers are more willing and able is probably the key word here, to employ the resource. So as the price of a resource falls and becomes more affordable, obviously, producers are going to be able to buy more and ramp up production because the price is so low. Their willingness probably isn't as important when we talk about price. You either need the resource or you're not. You can either use it or you can't. That's going to determine your willingness. But the change in price is actually going to change your ability to employ that resource as a producer. How much can you buy to use in production? Okay? If the price of a resource falls relative to other alternative resources, sometimes producers have choices, right? We can employ a person or we can employ a machine, right? Those are both resources. They're alternative resources. As the price of a resource falls relative to other alternative resources, we observe substitution in production. It's why we substitute machines in for people. Is because machines have seen a decrease, right, in price because technology makes machinery and things like that cheaper to produce. Well, it becomes more and more expensive to employ a human resource. So we do see substitution. It's cheaper to maintain a machine than a person. So just a couple of basic things to keep in mind about demand and demand for resources specifically. The market supply of resources. So we talked about the demand for resources. Now we're talking about supply. That's you and me, okay? This market supply for resources, you've already seen something similar to this, is the sum of all individual supply curves for that resource. Well, when we talked about the market supply for goods and services, it's the sum of individual supply curves as well. So this is just to illustrate that hasn't changed very much, okay? That a lot of things hold true for resource markets that also hold true for goods and service markets, okay? Resource suppliers are more willing and able to supply a resource as the price goes up. So if we go back to our example of labor, you and I are willing to supply more of our labor to an extent, and we'll see in chapter 12, we're going to talk about labor resources specifically, that you and I, that holds true for us to an extent, right? That we're more willing and able to supply our time as the price goes up. Why? Because as the price goes up, the utility that we're going to get from buying stuff with that higher level of income, our higher price, right? Our utility goes up. And so the more you're willing to pay me, chances are the more time I'm willing to give you to a point, right? Okay, so this is where things kind of start to get interesting about resources. And because resources have different uses, and because labor resources specifically are picky, we have to discuss price differentials, temporary and permanent price differentials. So there are resources that for short periods, similar resources that for short periods of time might actually have different prices associated with them. And then there are similar resources that will never have the same price. And so we're going to talk about the specifics of kind of those two examples. So this first statement here, it's a pretty important blanket statement about resources that proves to be true. And that is that resources tend to flow to the highest valued use. Well, that's usually also the highest paying use. Someone who values me the most is typically willing to pay the most for me. And if it's willing, if that use is willing to pay the most for me, then it's the one that I'm generally going to sell my resource to. So it kind of comes full circle, right? Whoever wants it most, that resource, is going to be willing to pay the most for it. And because they're willing to pay the most for it, are probably going to get it, especially when it comes to labor. Other resources as well, because if you own land, if you own trees, if you own oil as a household, right, you also derive utility from selling those resources and getting that money, which then you can turn around and provide yourself benefit or utility with, okay? But labor's that thing we all have. So this bottom statement here is what kind of sets the stage for determining whether we will see temporary or permanent resource price differentials for that particular pool of resources. It says, as long as the non-monetary benefits, so anything other than the price itself, as long as the non-monetary benefits of supplying resources to alternative uses are identical, and as long as resources are freely mobile, resources adjust across uses until they earn the same in different uses. Now, that's a whole lot of nothing right now. I'm going to show you some graphs on the next slide that I think will be helpful. But first, let's talk about non-monetary benefits. What things other than price might determine who you sell your resource of labor to? I want some answers, and I have nobody in my classroom today, so it's going to fall on those of you at home. Location of workplace. Thanks, Dennis. Okay. Is it a good location? Is it a bad location? Is it near home? Is it far away from home? Is it a desirable? Is it rural, right? Is it in a city? What's the location of the workplace? That is a non-monetary aspect, a non-monetary benefit, if you will. What else? Thank you, Devin. Perfect. Medical insurance. It's a big, big deal. Medical insurance is a big deal. And I know a lot of people who take pay cuts to go someplace with good medical benefits because it's that big of a deal, right? Great. What else? There's probably 100 different things here, folks. I want a couple more. What are the things you are going to consider when it's time to choose between job offers? What hours you work? Perfect. What hours you work? How many hours a week do you work? Do you have to work weekends? Right? Is there some flexibility in scheduling? Beautiful. Give me one more. Who are your coworkers? Perfect. Okay. Do you expect to like them? Do you expect to not like them? It's a big deal, right? Who are your coworkers? What kind of a work environment do you get to work in? Yeah, perfect. It can be a host of different things, right? How much do you like the job, right? What's the cost of living at this place where the job is? So that goes back to what Dennis said, like location of workplace. This could also be like the cost of living in that place. And is that money, what is that money going to be able to give you in that new location, right? Is your workplace outside, right? Is your workplace in a cubicle, right? Those are two totally different scenarios. So obviously there's lots of things to consider. In our example, especially when we talk about labor, these monetary benefits, these really are directed more at labor resource than the other resources. A tree really doesn't care what the non-monetary aspects are, right? So this is very much directed at labor, and you're going to see our example is labor. But for the sake of the analysis we're about to do, we have to hold these non-monetary benefits equal for all of these possible job opportunities, okay? So that we are just looking simply at the price of labor or the wage being offered and we don't have any of these other considerations because, you know, all of those other considerations, that would make an analysis virtually impossible, right? Okay, so I am going to, give me just a minute. I'm actually gonna pull this slide up into like presentation mode. Okay, this is gonna be helpful because it takes us through step by step, which I think will be meaningful in this case. Okay, so let me sort of set you up for this example. We have the market for carpenters in alternative uses. So we're talking about carpentry labor. Carpentry labor is the resource. The demand curves are for the industries employing, the firms employing the carpenters. The supply curves are the carpenters themselves, okay? So you can see that we have two possible uses for carpentry labor. Now, in reality, there's probably more than two, right? But we have home building and furniture making. At some period in time, we have a price differential. A price differential between what carpenters are making in home building and what carpenters are earning in furniture making. And that is just based on the equilibrium, supply and demand to those markets. So for home building carpenters, they're making $25 an hour, and furniture making carpenters are $20 an hour. And so they're being paid different wages. If you are, this is a temporary price differential, and here's why. It's a temporary price differential because if you are a carpenter in the furniture making industry and the non-monetary benefits of both jobs are considered equal, which means that you actually don't care if you're making furniture or home building, to you it's essentially all the same. What are you going to want to do if you are a furniture making carpenter in this scenario? What are you going to want to do? You're earning $20 an hour making furniture. Switch, thank you, Devin. I appreciate you chiming in. Switch to home building, okay? So if the non-monetary benefits are the same, you can see how some of the carpenters in the furniture making industry would want to no longer supply their labor to furniture making, but instead supply their labor to home building. When those carpenters change their mind, which they will, why wouldn't they, right? We're going to see a shift in the supply curve of both industries. The supply curve for furniture making is going to decrease, and the supply curve in home building is going to increase because we have furniture makers recognizing they could make more money in the home building market than in the furniture building market. That is going to continue to happen until the new equilibrium wage across all uses is equal. So these two markets had a temporary price differential that over time equalized, and now all carpenters are making approximately $24 an hour. It makes sense that this happens, right? Okay. Let me go back and reread this last part to you now that you've seen the graphs. As long as the non-monetary benefits of supplying resources to alternative uses, home building, furniture making, are identical, and as long as resources are freely mobile, that's a key point too, that a carpenter can actually physically go do a different job. Resources will adjust across uses until they earn the same in those different uses. So we had a temporary price differential in that carpentry between those carpentry labor markets, if you will, but over time, because the resources were freely mobile, that resource price across its different uses is going to equalize. So temporary price differentials, we're going to see that adjustment does take time. It does take time, right, for those carpenters to move from use to use. The price differences trigger the reallocation of resources. That was the carpenters moving from one to the next, which equalizes earnings for similar resources. Okay? Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about permanent resource price differentials. So there are, not all price differentials are going to cause reallocation for similar resources. We're not always going to see resources move because sometimes they can't move. Okay? So, or they will never be equal. They will never be equal, like carpentry labor clearly was across those two uses. Due to the inherent quality of a resource, non-monetary aspects, or the time or money involved to develop a skill, sometimes we just simply will not see that reallocation. So here's some good examples. An acre of land. An acre of land in the middle of Manhattan will never be worth the same as an acre of land in the middle of rural Kansas, right? That is simply the inherent quality of the resource, and that the resource can't physically be moved. You can't pick up, right, that acre of land in rural Kansas and move it to wherever you want to make it worth more. You just can't do that. And so that would be a permanent resource price differential. They're both an acre of land, but the inherent quality of that resource will never be the same, right? Its location. Time or money involved to develop a skill. Here we're talking about an hour of labor versus an hour of labor. An hour of labor with no skills and no training belonging to a 16-year-old will never be worth the hour of labor belonging to a 50-year-old who is trained and educated in the skill of brain surgery, right? They're both an hour of time, an hour of labor, but because of the time involved for one of those units of labor to develop a skill that the other just simply doesn't have, we will never see the price of that labor of hour be equalized over time. We just never will, okay? And non-monetary aspects. I mean, a job in a desirable location versus an undesirable location that pay the same amount of money, you know, I mean, you just can't equalize that over time, right? The location, you can't change it. So that brings us to a concept, two new concepts actually, that help us break down wages, break down resource prices in a way that we can represent their alternative uses and what that resource could have been used for in an alternative use, and how much that resource could have made in that alternative use. And these two concepts are called opportunity cost and economic rent. Now you understand opportunity cost, but we've never talked about opportunity cost as being a portion of the price of a resource, right? So let me give you an example before we run through all this that I think will help this make more sense. So I think your author's example is LeBron James. But when I started teaching this class a decade ago, the example he used was Shaquille O'Neal. And I'm going old school and we're going to keep this Shaquille O'Neal example, okay? Because he's an interesting resource, right? So does anybody know how much Shaquille O'Neal made annually at his basketball prime? Any thoughts, any guesses? Annual. About 30 million, okay? So Shaq made about $30 million playing basketball in endorsements and salary. So both endorsements and salary, about 30 million a year playing basketball. Does anyone know what other things Shaquille O'Neal tried to do with his labor resource besides basketball? This is Shaquille O'Neal's highest valued use, basketball. He had some lower valued uses. Shampoo commercials, thank you. What else? He had some interesting career exploration. Acting, exactly. There's one more, which was actually his second highest valued use. I know this is old school. You might all be too young. He tried to rap, okay? He did rap. I'm sorry, he did rap. And he did act, right? He actually made more with his music than he did on acting, so it is really his second highest valued use. You should go find a YouTube video, okay? But Shaq made about $1 million a year, right, rapping. So Shaquille O'Neal's highest valued use was $30 million annually playing basketball. His second highest valued use was $1 million. I know this is hard to see because of the glare, but you're going to get the idea. Was $1 million a year rapping. The opportunity cost, Shaquille O'Neal obviously, right, focused on basketball because it's his highest valued use. The opportunity cost of him playing basketball instead of rapping, the opportunity cost portion of this 30 million is the $1 million that he could have made per year had he really focused on rapping. It was very short-lived, right? And so $1 million of this 30, right, is going to be the opportunity cost, right? Sorry, opportunity cost. The remainder of that 30 million is something we call economic rent. Economic rent. So of this 30, 29 is economic rent. So let's go through this and let's kind of wrap our brain around how we would find these numbers for anybody, right? Opportunity cost, what the resource could earn in its best alternative use. So if we were doing that for ourselves, we would think, well, I am currently in this job teaching at NAU, right? What is the next best thing that I would be doing if I wasn't doing this, right? Well, that's what I gave up. That's the opportunity cost of my current job, if we're talking about the labor resource, right? The economic rent is the difference between the two. Like what you're getting above and beyond your opportunity cost. Now, the way your book defines this sounds a little confusing, okay? But we're gonna use our Shaquille O'Neal example. Economic rent by definition is the portion of the resource's earnings that exceeds the amount necessary to keep the resource in its present use. So theoretically, in order to incent Shaq to play basketball instead of rap, we really would only need to give him a penny more than rapping gave him. We would really, I mean, if he made $1 million and 1 cent playing basketball, that should have been enough to push him into basketball. Well, he got 30 million instead. So it's the portion of the resources earning above and beyond what is needed to keep them in their current use. His current use is basketball, right? That's the one he really chose to focus on. But in reality, anything above what he was being paid in his next best alternative use, a penny more should have been enough. So it's the difference between the two, or the difference between what I am making teaching and what I would be making, you know, someplace else. Now, I teach for less than I would probably make on the open market, but it's because the non-monetary benefits are different, right? But if they're the same, if he prefers these the same, then he would simply move into its next best alternative use for a penny, theoretically, okay? let's talk about the supply of Shaquille O'Neals in the world. How inelastic, how elastic is the supply of Shaquille O'Neals? Well, it's perfectly inelastic. There's only one, right? The less elastic a resource supply, the greater the economic rent as a portion of the total earnings. So when you have a limited supply of something like Shaq's, right? There's one. The portion of their total earnings that is economic rent is usually a majority, or is a very significant portion of their overall earnings. Because they're hard to replace, right? Hard to replace. And when he was in his prime, right, he was hard to replace. Any questions about that? Okay. So let's talk about, most resources are going to have a portion of their earnings that is economic rent and a portion of their earnings that is opportunity cost for most resources. The two we're going to talk about here are two very like polar opposite end of the spectrum resources, in which all of the price would be either economic rent or opportunity cost. And then I'll show you a more likely graph. So this first one is actually showing you supply and demand for, in this case, we're talking about acres of land, rural farmland. If you do not put crops on that acre of land in rural Kansas, what is its alternative use? Doesn't have one, okay? In which case there is no opportunity cost to using that land. It's not like you're using it for growing crops instead of. It's the only thing that's ever going to happen there, right? And so all of the price of that acre of land in rural Kansas is going to be economic rent. It doesn't have any other alternative uses, okay? So that's kind of what this first example is showing, right? You have this perfectly inelastic supply curve. There's 10 million acres of land or whatever in rural Kansas that isn't going to be used for anything else. And then we have this second graph, which shows a perfectly elastic supply curve. And all of the earnings of this labor would be considered opportunity costs. And here's a good example of that. So let's say, and this might be your author's example, I can't remember, but let's say we're talking about like janitorial labor. There's a going rate for janitorial labor. And if you leave your $10 an hour janitorial job, chances are you're going to leave it for another $10 an hour janitorial job. If that is what your skill is in janitorial services, then there probably is a pretty solid going rate for that. And the opportunity cost of leaving one job or of being employed by one job would be giving up another similar job that would pay you similar wage, okay? So this is just saying there is no economic rent for you from leaving one janitorial job going to another. It's all opportunity cost. It's just that. You're leaving one to go to another, okay? These examples, I mean, aren't uncommon, but for the most part, for most of us, when we do accept a wage to sell our resource to a producer, it is going to be a combination of economic rent and opportunity cost. And this is a graph I would probably make sure I understood for the exam. You'll likely see it. Is that when you and I decide, when all of the people in the market with similar skill sets as we do decide at what wage, at what price we're going to supply our labor and how much, it's going to be a little different for each one of us. Because for each one of us, the opportunity cost or what we're leaving behind is going to be a bit different than somebody else, right? So if we're talking about this market here that has an equilibrium wage of $20, if you look at the portion of the supply curve that lies below equilibrium, so that bottom portion of the supply curve from like equilibrium point down, those were all people that were willing to supply their labor for less than $20. That's what the supply curve represents. Is like how much you're willing to supply at every price. There were clearly people, lots of people willing to supply their labor at $10, $15, $17, etc. And so the reason they were probably willing to supply their labor at that amount is because it was just a little bit better than what they currently had. It was a little bit better than what they currently had, right? Now, if they were willing to accept $10 and they got $20, that difference is economic rent, okay? Shaquille O'Neal would have moved to basketball for a penny more than $1 million, but he got 30 million instead. So he got economic rent of 29 million. For you and I, right, it's not on that scale, but we still can receive economic rent. And it's usually based on what we're leaving, what our next best thing is. And anything better than that in terms of wages covers our opportunity costs, right? The job we left, plus is giving us just a little more. Well, in this case, if you were willing to take 10 because you were leaving a job that paid you $9.95 an hour, and you were willing to go someplace that paid you 10, right? Theoretically, that would be true. But you got 20, that $10 difference is going to be economic rent for you. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. This is a good place to